Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today I'm joined by my dear friend Kevin Gamble. He and I are going to discuss a topic, and I just wanted to start off by seeing if Kevin had any questions about anything that's been going on the channel recently.
Hey Tris, good to be here as always, and a lot of good stuff to potentially talk about. But we recently had a conversation about old rock icons taking up space to this day, and kind of the downsides of that. But one thing I was wondering about in reference to that is, are there any examples that you have of sort of an iconic classic rock guitarist who should take up more space, who should be more recognized and more acknowledged and more a part of the conversation to this day? What's an example of that from your point of view?
Well, the first person that jumps into my mind is, a lot of these iconic players are the, kind of the blues-based, the white blues-based players of the day, and I don't need to name all of them off. Everybody knows who they are. Leslie West would be the omitted person from that very short list of amazing players. His phrasing, I think, is superior to almost everybody's except for maybe Jeff Beck's. He's right there with Gilmour in my estimation, and two, with his note choices, his ability to leave space, his crushing tone. I mean, you talk about the origins of heavy rock or even, metal or thrash. I mean, he was getting those tones, but he was also very clear and very clean in his playing. And I think that the most fascinating thing about him, besides his, note choices and his output and his songwriting and, and all of that stuff, he was not an equipment person. I mean, he was using a single pickup Les Paul Jr. for the most part of his, for the iconic part of his career, a student level instrument, and famously also played through an old PA head, and PA cabinets, because he was scheduled to play with Mountain at the Fillmore. They'd ordered some tube amps from Sun. Sun sent the wrong things and sent them a PA system, and he made that PA system work for himself. And the fact that there's no magic formula marketed out there to capture Leslie West's tone, I think, is a fascinating thing. He used what he had at hand, which was, a PA head and a crappy single pickup Gibson guitar, and forged a whole sound and a whole, kind of legendary thing, using very unorthodox equipment. And it's not something you can just put, I know that he did some signature stuff later in his life with Dean and stuff like that, but it was basically just a Les Paul Jr. tweaked a little bit. And but he also was asked by Gibson to do signature Les Paul Juniors, and he's like, well, it's the same thing that you would get off the shelf, so why would I put my name on it? And that's telling too. I think he's just a class act, cool guy, amazing tone, and like I said, he hasn't like spawned this giant marketplace of, to sound like him, I have to have X, Y, and Z. He did his own thing, and that's what I find so inspiring about him, is that you can, it's a lesson in use what you have, and then you can turn yourself into an icon just through your playing, So that'd be my example.
That's a great way to put it, a real icon of DIY, but also somebody who couldn't make as much out of him maybe in as many ways as they could the other iconic guitarists, either through image or equipment or his aesthetic and his work ethic, what have you. So many of the other guys that we know were just more readily able to be marketed, manufactured, and stamped out and sold. So yeah, great example. Definitely agree with that. As far as something coming to mind for me, the first guy I think of is probably Richard Thompson. And if people don't already know about him, there's Fairport Convention, which was really kind of primordial in starting the sort of British folk introduction into electric music. And then he had a fantastic solo career, very distinctive, very singular in his playing style, both on a acoustic and electric. One thing I think about him is that, first of all, he was very British, which limited to some extent his marketability in the U.S., both in terms of his original music style, which was British folk connected, and just his sensibility, his lyric sensibility, and so forth. But another thing about him that I think, this is my own interpretation of, is that he was really connected to a tradition. He was connected to a specific folk tradition, a lot of roots intertwined together, and it's almost a form of musical literacy required to connect to that. It's not just that sort of illiterate rock accessibility. And I almost feel like that's kind of gone out of favor over time in the mainstream, is that, you almost have to have some context to really appreciate what he's doing and understand what he's doing. And I think that there's not as much of that in the common culture these days, and the context for that kind of fell away. And we're in much more of a sort of immediate, I hate to use a harsh word like illiterate, but a lot of the context for really appreciating some of these guitarists has sort of fallen out of the popular discourse. So there aren't as many points of reference for people to appreciate him now, maybe as there had been previously. But I think both of these guys are incredibly worth checking out, and have a great body of work that anybody can learn from, and it will sound fresh and different and energetic compared to what the more familiar guys have done.
Well, Thompson's had a robust, all the way through career too. You can find stuff that's very, up to date on him all over the place. And so everybody, maybe when you go through and timestamp this, go ahead and we'll get some links in there to some of his most recent stuff, because I think that you have a good point with the loss of history or the sense of literacy, but I think people are willing to go down those rabbit holes. So if you kick the door open a little bit for them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, I have a topic. This is something that came up a few years ago that has been gnawing at me, and I've talked a little bit to you about it on a couple of your visits out here to see me, and it's the legacy of grunge. I feel like it's something that was a big part of our lives because we graduated from high school in 1990. Grunge was hit, Soundgarden was already in our wheelhouse before Nirvana came around. We were aware of this stuff, this new thing that was kind of emerging that wasn't necessarily hair metal. Also Alice in Chains, because they were out before Nirvana. We were watching videos of Man in the Box, long before we ever knew who Nirvana was. So anyway, but the thing that set me off about thinking about grunge and thinking about grunge's legacy was, a few years ago, I was watching this video, Rick Beato. I'm just going to willfully throw him under the bus. But anyway, he was doing one of his, overzealous, love letters to Alice in Chains, and just kind of going on and on and on. And I realized they have great music, but just kind of like, and then at the end of like going over this stuff and just really, fawning over them, he was like, where did this music come from? There's such a sadness and a heaviness and a deepness to it. And he's kind of quizzically looking at the cameras. Where did it come from? And immediately in my head, because, I moved to Portland on the back end of grunge, about 1996. I embedded myself in the scene there for well over a decade, being very active, playing and booking shows and doing sound, having a studio, being in bands and fronting my own bands. So I was deep into the West Coast scene, and if you were playing in Portland, you played Seattle. So I saw the tail end of a lot of this stuff, and the first thing that popped into my head was misery, depression, drug abuse, mental illness. Those all played huge roles in how a lot of this music was formed, and the people who were involved in making it and the people who were enabling the scene, it was a toxic environment. It was a place where, drug use and depression and alcoholism were assumed to be part of the tortured artist canvas. And it was almost expected. Nobody ever looked at anybody and said, hey, you drink too much. Maybe we should slow down or get some help, or, oh, you seem depressed. Maybe we should talk to somebody. So it was something that really struck me because there's so much leftover damage and misery from the entire grunge movement. I mean, how many lead singers from the iconic bands of that time are still alive? Mark Arm of Mudhoney and Eddie Vedder. And then everybody else is either a suicide or an overdose. And so I think that, and I don't want to go, oh, that somehow takes something away from the music. I'm not talking about the music. I'm saying that grunge is a movement. Grunge as a community is often talked about as if it were some sort of a revisiting of the 60s or something like that, of this freedom and this, huge exploration. And there was some of that involved, but there was also a lot of bad choices being made and no help for anybody who needed help, perhaps. So, anyway, I just wanted to kind of put that out there and see what your reaction. I mean, you've watched my own personal struggles, but as far as, what I observed and what I just expressed there, what do you think? Is it off base to kind of shine a flashlight onto that and go, hey, maybe we should stop romanticizing this and actually look at what was happening?
Yeah, I think what you just said, romanticizing, is really a key part of it. And I think you really framed it well in terms of where this musical wave hit. The sort of rock star concept, the music scene concept, was really only, a couple decades, 25 years old at the time that rock came on, or grunge came along. So it really was following wave after wave of increasing sort of rock or music stardom excess, whether it was the huge wave of drugs in the 60s and 70s, the all kinds of wretched excess of the 80s, following right on the heels of hair metal, pop metal, which just seemed to get bigger and more inflated by the year. It was, in some ways, it almost seems like an inevitable reckoning where eventually we would get to the point where that so defined the development of the culture around the music that it had to crash at some point. There had to be a fall. And like you said, all of this happened in the context where there wasn't a flashlight being shined on it. There wasn't support for this. There wasn't, the popular view of this was still romanticizing. It was still admiring the damage involved in this. And so it kind of went from the shiny, bright, celebratory excess of the pop metal phase to the romantic, wounded poet phase of the grunge era, but it was still being romanticized. And so it was unsustainable for that to continue without there being a reckoning of some kind. And as you mentioned, so many people have been lost in the process, despite having huge success and fame and celebrity. None of that was an antidote for what was fueling it underneath.
Well, here, and what was fueling it underneath, and this is really important. On the local scenes in both Seattle and Portland, and to a lesser extent down in San Francisco, I spent a fair amount of time down there as well, knew a lot of people during that, late 90s through the, first decade of the new millennium of the 2000s. And the thing is that everybody kind of was still emulating that. I mean, it was still a game of excess. It was still a game that to be legit, you had to do the drugs, you had to you had to outdrink everybody. If you had problems, then your problems were part of you and you wore them like a badge of honor kind of thing. And I wrote down, if you, and a lot of people, don't realize that the local musician scene, emulating kind of that, and in the you know on the coattails of grunge, or the end of grunge, or the detritus, flotsam and jetsam, grabbing onto something and continuing to try to keep it going, you know, chasing the myth of everything. There's a lot of people that I used to play music with who are not around anymore, or have succumbed completely to addiction or whatever, and are non-functional. And there's a handful of us, though, who did get sober and kind of like, decided to still pursue music, but do it in a more meaningful way, not like trying to be cool or be on the scene. Part of it's just aging out. But it's something that I think I see it now with newer bands. And this also struck me when I was watching the Beato thing, and I was like, because he was kind of like also, going, well, these new bands don't have any, they don't have the same chutzpah that Alice in Chains had or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but the new bands do crazy stuff like, oh boy, I'm burned out, we're not going to tour. Oh boy, I need a mental health break. So people actually will just stop for a while and go seek help, and they're open about it on social media. I see this a lot of times with these younger bands. They actually take care of themselves. And I think that is something that's amazing, because it's like, what could be cooler than that, to go, hey, I'm beginning to think I have a problem, so maybe I need to step back and take care of myself. Mm-hmm. And I think that there still is this hangover or perception in the media that somehow it's going to be cool to, burn out and die young. But look at Neil Young. He's still alive, and he's like 80 years old, all these guys who are still going, they became healthy at a certain point. And I don't think grunge ever gets the chance of going, oh, let's go back and look at how people got healthy, because Mudhoney is the only example of one of the deeply embedded, started in the early 80s, example, their origins in the early 80s. Pearl Jam to a lesser extent, but a true grunge band like Mudhoney, they got clean, and they're still out there playing, and they still have day jobs, and they still have their marginal level of success, but they didn't, they're kind of the only example you could put out there. Everybody else is dead. So it's just, I think that people forget that the waves of the stars wash down through all of the A list, from the A list to the B list to the C list to the, I was low C list, high D list, level artist during this whole thing. And it washes through, and it just leaves a wave of destruction.
Yeah, hangover is a good word, and in multiple senses it really has been. And I think that, in some ways, maybe something darker or more nihilistic as a response to what had just preceded it was natural. But when that had to define your identity in order to function, that was, to me, kind of a functional shift. I mean, the hard partying rock star was already well established at that point. But as you said, you had to have these, fundamental internal traits. You had to really inhabit that nihilism, and that just wasn't going to be sustainable. And then the hangover, both of that, you can still see that in the perception that doesn't ever seem to go away of the self-destructive rock artist. And then the aesthetic of the music too has really been a long-term hangover as well, mm-hmm. that the industry and the press hasn't been able to let go of, I think. And a slight fork in the topic, but it feels to me like the perception of what the music is or can be has really gotten stuck in the mud since then. I think it's starting to emerge, but I think for so long after that, the people think that grunge stopped in the mid 90s, but it really didn't. I think that rock music is still kind of stuck in the aesthetic that formed at that time. It's become as much of a uniform for rock music. If you see the way rock bands dress and look and present themselves now, it just feels like a uniform now that rock hasn't successfully broken out of, so I think that we still haven't gotten full perspective on that. And but you're seeing some departure from that. You're seeing younger musicians who, for example, as you said, aren't afraid to take care of themselves physically and mentally, who aren't afraid to be virtuosos on their instruments, who aren't afraid to create really ambitious music that requires a lot of discipline, even as they put something fresh and youthful and modern on it. So we're starting to see that at the grassroots level. I think a lot of that is reemerging as acceptable, or even preferable, that as a community and as a style of being an artist in the world, it doesn't have to be that sort of anti-accomplishment, anti-technique, anti-health,
or anti-self.
or anti-self. Yeah,
that's what I feel like is kind of the point I was trying to make, is that
that's a great way to put it.
The self-destructiveness of it all, just the self-defeat in it, the you keep saying nihilism, and I don't even know if it was that well formed. It was more just like not taking care of yourself because it wasn't cool to care,
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the equation when people look back at grunge that is fully left out. And people don't like to go into any detail. Like when I hear, like I said, I want to keep saying his name, but when Beato's like extolling the virtues of all the grunge bands all the time, it's just kind of like, yeah, these were really miserable people, and I knew people who knew people who knew people, and it's just like, yeah, they're miserable. We used to sit around the bar talking about Lane's probably getting drugs from Mark Lanigan right now, getting high, and we'd just be kind of callously laughing about it, and that's just fucked up.
Yeah,
because he was it's still alive back then.
Yeah, and it's still right on the heels of artists today. I mean, if you look at somebody like Dave Grohl and Foo Fighters, it's like he came right out of that, with what happened to Kurt Cobain, and then it's Taylor Hawkins. It's like there's no escape velocity that's been achieved. This is still happening. It's still consuming people. It's still pulling people under, and it's still this romanticized mythology that isn't. I would think something like that happening in the time we're in now would really help shine that light. But it seems like it's forgotten pretty quickly and romanticized all over again, and inconvenient aspects of it are ignored.
Well, and perhaps this is a good place to kind of like wrap it up, because you just mentioned something that I was kind of afraid to put out there, but now that you've opened the door to it, I will kind of conclude with this idea. The Taylor Hawkins example is perfect, because just 2 years before that, Dave Grohl was on record, it was some radio interview or something. He's just like, before we go on, I have a 6-pack and I have 3 shots of Jaeger just to get warmed up for the show. And he's like, so he's still like in that place, that kind of juvenile place where it's like, it's cool to get really drunk before you get on stage. And then, we find out that Taylor had, God knows what in his system. And it was so, like you just said, it's still that the fact that happened. And then we have a big party at Wembley over it, where everybody's probably, all the older rock stars are still getting, drunk and whatever behind, backstage. And, it just, there comes a point where it's like, people don't need to die for this. You know what I mean? It's just music, and we're supposed to actually have fun, and not get hurt.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll end on that bummer of a note. We'll see. We'll see if anybody gets super angry about this one, because there's some controversial things have been said in this conversation, but I think they need to be said. I think that it is fine if you do want to have a drink or two or do whatever it is, but when things become self-destructive and when things get out of hand, which they do very easily, I think that musicians need to remember that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to stop. It's okay to refuse to do things. Like, I'm not going on tour because that's not going to be good for me, and things like that. And I just wanted to just really openly talk about that and some of my own personal experiences. So anyway, if you made it this far into the video, I'm sure you have a comment. So I'd love to hear it. Likes and shares are greatly appreciated. And of course, the big old subscribe button. Subscriptions are doing really well. Kevin and I are excited to continue to build the channel. We can make things more interactive. We can have more things happening once we get to some certain numbers, and we're headed there. And I'm very grateful to everybody's support thus far in our journey, and I hope that you join us on our journey as we continue forward. You take care, and we'll see you next time.